Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to the next phase of our event today. Has been an amazing day. What a full program and what great presentations this morning. I hope you were able to join us for those. So now we want to bring you to the next phase of this program, which is what a treat, a tour of the Royall House Museum in Medford. I don't know about you, but as I was planning this event, it was the first time that I heard about this. And I was so impressed, and I am delighted that we can bring this to you today. Next slide, please. So today's program will be presented by the museum. They will take us on a tour guided by the executive director, which I will introduce to you in a minute. And then we'll have an opportunity to answer your questions and have a conversation with Krista Egan, the Senior Director of MGH Center for Community Health Improvement. We are very, very lucky to also be joined by the MGH Youth Scholars who are here to learn about the museum as well. Next slide, please. I also like to take this opportunity to thank again our sponsors, the MGH Radiology Department, the MGH Equity and Community Health Office, as well as the People's Heart Project, and obviously the museum, as well as CCHI, Center for Community Health Improvement at MGH. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the Executive Director of the Royall House Enslaved Quarters here in Medford, Massachusetts. Kiara Singleton is the Executive Director of the Royall House. She is also a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor in the Department of American Culture for the 2021-2022 academic year. She is an academic democracy fellow in the Charles Warren Center for Studies in the American History at Harvard University. Before joining the Warren Center as an American democracy fellow, she held a prestigious academic fellowship from the Brennick Foundation and Mellon Foundation, Emory University. I'll let you read the rest of this, and I'd like to now turn over to Kiara, who will give us an introduction of the museum. Thank you, Kiara.
Thank you, Carmen. Hi, everyone. I'm really honored to be here today, and I'm really happy to show you our museum. So I'm not going to speak for too long because we have a virtual tour that will take you through every single part of the museum. We've been closed over the last year due to the pandemic, so this has been one of the ways that we've been able to make sure that the museum remains accessible and that people can still visit virtually even if you can't get to the museum in person. So without further ado, I just want to say thank you to MGH for hosting us, and I'm delighted to show you our virtual tour. Sorry. Welcome. My name is Kiara Singleton, and I am the Executive Director of the Royall House Enslaved Quarters, a museum that is located in Medford, Massachusetts. Our museum has existed since 1899, and in 1960, we were designated a National Historic Landmark. Our museum tells the complicated history of Northern slavery and contestations of freedom in the 18th century, through telling the story of the wealthy royal family and the Black people they enslaved to create their wealth. Before I tell you more about our site, I just want to provide some historical context about slavery in the North.
When we often think about slavery in the United States, we think about the South. However, that is a mistake. Slavery was a vital part of the North's economy. Slavery in Massachusetts really began in the 1600s when European settlers enslaved indigenous populations. Not only did they enslave indigenous peoples, but they stole their land. And on this land, they cultivated food, livestock, and wood that was then used to fuel sugarcane plantations in the West Indies. In 1641, Massachusetts became the first American colony to formally legalize slavery. By 1650, scholars such as Wendy Warren assert that over half of the ships that were going in and out of the Boston Harbor were going to and from the sugarcane plantations throughout the West Indies. So it's really important that when we think about the history of slavery in Massachusetts, that we think about how both indigenous people and Africans were enslaved in order to fuel the North's economy. That brings us back to our site. In 1737, Isaac Royall Sr., who had made a fortune as a merchant mariner, as well as a sugarcane plantation owner in Antigua, moves his family from Antigua back to his native New England to live on Ten Hills Farm. Ten Hills Farm was a 500-acre estate that Isaac Royall Sr. purchased in 1732. Ten Hills Farm was once occupied by Governor Winthrop, and the land was part of his 1631 land grant. When the royal family moves here in 1737, they bring over 27 enslaved women, children, and men. Where I'm standing is in front of the summer kitchen or the out kitchen. This kitchen, which is located outside of the main estate, which you'll see a little bit later, was used by the enslaved people, most likely enslaved women, to prepare food for the royal family during the hotter summer months. And if you follow me, we'll go to one of my favorite panels in the museum. From about 1737 until the start of the American Revolution, the royal family enslaved over the course of these decades some 60 women, children, and men who maintained the 500 acres. While we don't have full names of the enslaved people who lived here, we do know some of their first names, and we've listed them all. And this is really, really vital for us because it really drives home the point that this place is a site of memory. Now that I've given you some background information about the history of Northern slavery, as well as the royal family, our wonderful tour guide, Lee LaFleur, is going to take you throughout the grounds and into the main house so that he can show you how we talk about the interconnected and complex lives of the royal family and the enslaved people who made their lavish lifestyle possible. I really hope you enjoy your tour.
Hello, my name is Lee LaFleur, and I'm happy to welcome you to the Royal House and Slave Quarters. On today's tour, we will be talking about the lives of the royal family and the lives of the people that they enslaved who lived here at this very location. When we talk about the Isaac Royall House, we're actually talking about two separate Isaac Royalls, Isaac Royall Sr. and Isaac Royall Jr., his son, who is in fact probably the most famous of the two. Isaac Royall Sr. was a plantation owner on the island of Antigua, where he grew sugarcane and enslaved many black women, men, and children. Their family was part of the triangle trade, which involved turning sugarcane into rum, which was then taken to Africa and sold in order to enslave more individuals. In 1737, he moved his entire family from the island of Antigua here to Medford, Massachusetts, along with 27 enslaved individuals. The place we're standing in used to be known as Ten Hills Farm, and it's much larger than the space that we're seeing at the moment. Ten Hills Farm was roughly a 500-acre farm, formerly owned by the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop. In 1732, Isaac Royall Sr. purchased the main building on this property. Over the course of the next 5 years, working with his brother, They enlarged the existing house into a 3-story mansion, added a stable, a carriage house, as well as formal gardens. In addition to expanding the mansion, they also had a summer kitchen built. Summer kitchens are popular in the Caribbean where it's too hot to cook inside the house. These kitchens allow you to do cooking outside of the main structure. The clapboard structure behind me is the slave quarters, and this was thought to have been built a number of years after the Royals arrived here. The summer kitchen, which is here on my left, and the winter kitchen inside the house here on my right are only about 35 feet apart from one another. So you can imagine that people might have been moving between both locations at any time in preparing food. And those people would have been the enslaved people who lived here at this location. Here we are inside of the winter kitchen. We start the tour inside of the winter kitchen to help sort of center the lives of the enslaved people who lived and worked in this space. In 1739, just 2 years after the Royals move here, Isaac Royall Sr. passes away. At that time, a room-by-room inventory was done of the entire property. This is how we know what structures were on the property and which items were in the house. It's also how we know a lot about the enslaved people who were living here at that time. According to the inventory, we've been able to identify a number of the things that are in this very room. For instance, we know that the Royals owned a spit jack, which is a kitchen efficiency tool of sorts used for rotating meats primarily in front of a fire. In addition to that, we know that the Royals had a number of expensive items such as pewter dishes, which would have been imported from Europe. This space is a workspace primarily for enslaved people who lived and worked at Royall House. The work that they would have been doing not only would have involved maintaining the farm, the livestock, and the orchards that are here on the property, but also in preparing food for the Royals and their guests. Food preparation at Royall House would have been an enterprise that happened all year round. Remember, here in New England, where the winters are very cold, very little that's being grown at that point in time in the year. So the enslaved people would have been responsible for preparing food and storing food and preserving it for the Royals to eat all year round. Enslaved women would have been primarily responsible for cooking, curing meat, milking cows, churning butter, skimming cream, and picking berries to make preserves, juices, jams, jellies, and pies. This is the cooking hearth inside of the winter kitchen, and here you can see some of the utensils that the enslaved women in particular would have used when preparing meals here. So you can see a number of different pots, a number of spatulas, and some of the ladles here. This is an oven that could have been used for baking bread or other items for the Royals to eat. The 1739 probate inventory lists right here in the winter kitchen that there were actually 5 Negro beds or bedding in this very room. So we can get a sense of what those items might have been like. This means that not only was the kitchen a workspace, but there were actually enslaved people who slept in this very spot, which may have been useful to the Royals if the enslaved people needed to be doing cooking throughout the day and throughout the night, or if they were needed for other tasks within the home. Here we are in the dining room at the Royall House. So this is the place where the Royals would have had their meals. This room also showcases the wealth of the Royals. The 1739 inventory lists a number of expensive items in this room, including these Cheney plates, champagne glasses, and the sconce, which is the most expensive item in this room. We also know with its proximity to the kitchen that there would have been enslaved people, primarily women, who would have been serving the meals for the Royals as they dined here. Additionally, when you look at the woodwork around this room, we know that there would have been enslaved people who were responsible for taking care of this wood and maintaining this room. Here we are in the east parlor and the west parlor of the house. In this space, you can really see some of the decorative flourishes that the Royals put into the design of this space. In addition to the window seats, which we've seen in other spaces of the house, you also have the Delft tiles, which are in almost every room. The parlors actually serve a dual purpose. You can have the doors closed to create a more cozy space. Particularly in the wintertime, you can imagine having the fireplace going and sitting in a comfy chair by the fire. But with the doors open, they could use the entire space for entertaining, which we know the Royals did a lot of during their time here. With the doors open here in the west parlor, you can actually see how much more grand this space is than that one over there. The west parlor is one of the rooms added by the Royals, and its extravagance is marked by its high ceilings. One of the things we like to highlight in this space is the archways and the pillars, which are even more decorative than they are in the east parlor. As one of the more prominent families in the Boston area in the mid-1700s, the Royals did a lot of entertaining. We know that the enslaved people who lived and worked in this house would have been responsible for cooking the food and serving the guests who would have come for parties at the Royals' house. In addition to that, once the parties were over, we know that the enslaved people were responsible for staying up long hours cleaning up after guests. Here we have a portrait of Isaac Royall Jr. at age 22. This is shortly after the death of his father, as he became not only the man of the house, but essentially the owner of this house in general and also the plantations in Antigua. Isaac Royall also had a younger sister whose name was Penelope. And upon the death of their father, not only did Isaac Royall inherit some of the enslaved people, but Penelope also inherited some of the enslaved people who lived here as well. Isaac Royall Jr. is probably the better known of the two Isaac Royals. He was a businessman, he owned a tavern, he owned many acres of farmland, not only here in Massachusetts, but in also other parts of New England. In addition to maintaining ownership into the plantations that were in Antigua, he also was a person who was part of the Governor's Council here in Massachusetts. This is a painting by John Singleton Copley of Mary and Elizabeth Royall, who were the daughters of Isaac Royall Jr. The original for this painting is hanging in the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston. I like to point to this picture because Mary and Elizabeth Royall lived here in the house with the royal family. But there were also a number of enslaved families and children who lived here at the same time. While we don't know necessarily how close these families interacted, we do know that enslaved people lived in this very house, and that the slave quarters itself is only 35 feet away. So we know that these people were certainly in each other's lives and must have been having some sort of relationship with one another. When Isaac's sister Penelope gets married, we know that she moves into Cambridge with her husband and 7 of the enslaved people she inherited from her father. This gives us an opportunity to think about how enslaved families who lived here at the Royal House were being separated when the Royals moved to new locations. We don't really know how often then those families and those family members were able to be in touch with one another. We do know that Isaac and his sister were relatively close, so perhaps one of the enslaved people would get to travel with them or pass a message with them when they went to visit one another. But this is just an example of how enslaved families were affected by slavery, even right here in the North. We have the names of approximately 60 enslaved people who lived here at the Royal House. Yet we know that when the Royals first arrived here, they came with only 27 people. That means during the time that the Royals were here, they were selling people, buying people, trading people, and we know from an ad that was placed in a newspaper that Isaac Royall sold a man named George to someone else who lived in the city of Lynn, because that person ran away. Running away is one of the acts of resistance that enslaved people used to free themselves from bondage. However, it's worth pointing out that in a place like Medford, Massachusetts in the 1700s, there were not very many enslaved people around, and so running away was actually a really tricky enterprise to undertake. Enslaved people used a variety of other means, however, to show their resistance to the institution. In some cases, slowing down work that they were charged with doing. In other cases, breaking dishes. In some cases, feigning ignorance about what someone was asking them to do. This stairwell leads from the winter kitchen to the kitchen chamber, which is right here on the second floor. These stairs also go from the basement to the attic, all workspaces that would have been used by the enslaved people. These spaces included a root cellar and a spinning garret for textile work. On the third floor, above the kitchen chamber, the inventory lists bedding and a Negro cradle, so we know that enslaved people would have also occupied that space. This stairwell then would have been used by the enslaved people who were working in the kitchen on their way to this storage room right above it. You can imagine then that they would be carrying items either from another place in the house or from the kitchen to be stored upstairs in this room. You can see how worn and warped these stairs are in particular places. You can also notice how they're shaped as sort of narrow triangles, which would make it really difficult to be lifting items to carry up these stairs. This particular stairwell is also sort of out of sight for the rest of the house. So the enslaved people would have used this, but probably not the Royals and probably not their guests. You can also see through this window the slave quarters itself. So not only are we very close to the slave quarters, but guests would not have been able to see this structure unless they were using this stairwell, and neither would the Royals. Welcome to the second floor of the house. This room is known as the kitchen chamber, in part because it's above the kitchen. In terms of the use of this room, we know that it was a storage room and also a work room, primarily for the enslaved people who lived and worked in the house. In addition to the closets and storage spaces that are native to this room, the inventory also lists a number of trunks that are located in this space. A number of different types of linens were listed as being in this room, including 24 tablecloths, 15 napkins, and a dozen towels. Compared with the design and architecture of the other rooms in the house, one of the things you'll notice about this space is that it is very plain in its design. The walls are bare. You'll notice there are no window seats in this room, and the windows themselves are also quite plain. Looking here at the fireplace, as compared to the other fireplaces throughout the house, you'll notice that there are no tiles lining these fireplaces. And there's just basically the plain brick background here. This just gives you a sense of how this room was valued compared to other rooms in the house that we'll be visiting. We know that this space was used for a number of different purposes. One of those purposes was, we believe, as a dressing room. This item here on the table is a goffering iron that would have been used for ironing the ruffles on a frilly shirt. Other items in this room are more for mending clothes or creating clothes, which is something that we believe the enslaved people who lived here would have also done. There is a sewing kit that is currently in this room on the table, and in addition to that, a number of pieces of fabric were found in this room, including slave cloth, which we know would have been used to make clothing that the enslaved people would have worn. The 1739 inventory for this room lists 2 sets of Negro bedding in this space. You can see the beds that are here are very simple beds, very low to the ground and very plain. We know that this, as I have already said, was a workspace. So not only was it a workspace, but it also doubled then as a sleeping quarters for the enslaved people who would have constantly been working around the clock, keeping fireplaces going, sewing, mending clothes, a wide variety of tasks that would have taken up most of their time. We'll also notice as we continue on the tour that this room, this space, is in very close proximity to the other rooms in the house, which would have meant the enslaved people were living in very close quarters with the Royals themselves. The inventory for this room also lists a looking glass as being one of the items that was here. So we know that this room also, in addition to being a workroom and a sleeping quarters for the enslaved people, we know that this space was also a dressing room for the Royals. So you can imagine Isaac Royall coming in here from his bedroom just across the hallway, standing here in front of this looking glass and being assisted or attended to by one of the enslaved people, perhaps helping him to put on his vest, helping him with his powdered wig, helping him to put on his ruffly shirts. So now we come to the marble chamber, which would have been the master bedroom for the house. So this is the room that Isaac Royall and his family would have slept in. We also believe that if there were esteemed guests who maybe came to visit the royal family, that Isaac Royall may have let them use this room. This room is directly across the hallway from the kitchen chamber, which is where we know that there were enslaved people sleeping and working. As the master bedroom, the marble chamber is really the most ornate room in the house. You'll notice the marbling on the archways and pillars here, which is how the room presumably gets its name. In addition to that, you'll also notice the window seats, which would allow someone to sit here in the window and read with the sun coming in through the windows. This canopy bed is probably the most expensive item in this bedroom. You will also notice this silk dressing gown, which is the kind of thing Isaac Royall would have worn around the house throughout the day and into the evening, along with a matching cap to replace his wig. You can imagine the enslaved people who would have helped him to get dressed for bed and who would have come over just from across the hallway in the kitchen chamber where they're sleeping and working to help keep the fireplaces going, and before he got into bed, use this bed warmer to help warm up the comforter at night. Massachusetts winters are particularly cold. So throughout the night, enslaved people who lived and worked here would have needed to make sure that the fires were going and that the rooms were warm, and would have needed to have been very quiet as they were doing that work, moving throughout the house. I wanted to point out as well the detailed Delft tiles that you'll find in the fireplaces throughout the house. You'll notice that these tiles themselves each have different images that are printed on them, which makes them really interesting to look at as we tour around the house. But again, I want to remind you that across the hallway in the kitchen chamber, there are no tiles in that room. Isaac Royall Jr. received a mahogany desk very much like this one on his 17th birthday. But this chemistry textbook was actually owned by Isaac Royall. Here inside this book, you can actually see a copy of the Royall family crest, which includes 3 sheaths of wheat. This crest was also the official crest of the Harvard Law School. In 2016, due to protests over the connections between the Royall family, the university, and slavery, the crest was removed from Harvard Law School. Welcome to the Freedom and Emancipation Room, which is our final stop on the tour of the mansion. The ideas and items in this room represent a variety of perspectives on freedom around the time of the American Revolution and the period just thereafter. Isaac Royall Jr. was a loyalist who abandoned this house on the eve of the American Revolution and left behind the enslaved people who lived here. On my right here, we have a tavern sign from Jonathan Porter's Tavern in Medford Square. The bullet hole in it is said to be from Medford Minutemen returning from Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, upon realizing that its illustration is the British Royal Coat of Arms. On my left here, we have a portrait of George Washington. This house was used as a base of operations by the colonial army during the American Revolution. General Stark, Lee, and Sullivan were all said to have been here, as well as George Washington. And it's also said that there were prisoners of war who were interrogated in the marble chamber we visited previously. Here on this side of the room, we have a variety of different panels on the wall that highlight some different perspectives on freedom at the time of the American Revolution. From quotes from Abigail Adams to Chief Justice William Cushing, we hear the voices of people who are thinking about what freedom means to Americans, but also to the enslaved Africans who were here in the country at the time. We have a quote from Mum Bet, who petitioned for her own freedom. And it's important to think about how enslaved Africans used this moment and the language of the revolution to talk about their own freedom and how it was not necessarily being included in the struggle for American freedom. This panel features the words of Isaac Royall Jr. from his will, in which he offers Belinda Sutton, one of the women who was enslaved here at the Isaac Royall House and Slave Quarters, her freedom or the option to remain enslaved. Belinda chooses her freedom. In order to support herself and her daughter, she petitions the Massachusetts legislature for a pension from the Royall estate. Surprisingly, the legislature approves Belinda's petition. Enslaved and free blacks in Massachusetts use rhetoric of revolution to argue for freedom in formal petitions and in poetry. Thank you for joining us on the tour of the main house. I hope that the tour has helped to highlight the parallel lives of the Royall family and the enslaved people who made their lavish lifestyle possible. I hope that you can join us one day here on site to learn more about the museum and the history of Northern slavery. Again, my name is Leila Fleur. Thank you for joining us.
Right now, we are in the slave quarters, which are the only freestanding slave quarters in the northern United States. In 1923, the newly formed Royall House Association actually transformed this space into the meeting room that you see today. However, one of our goals as a museum is to actually transform it back to its original structure. Based on archaeological evidence, we know that around 1760, that the out kitchen, which we saw earlier, was expanded to include this entire structure, which is now the slave quarters. On the first floor, we know that this room was originally divided into 3 narrow spaces. We believe certain tasks happened in these spaces, that they served as workspaces and also storage spaces. We believe that enslaved people were cooking here, doing other tasks such as laundry, and that the space could have also doubled as a dairy for the Royall family. On the second floor would have been the sleeping spaces for enslaved people. Enslaved persons who worked elsewhere on the Royall estate likely slept in barns and other structures that no longer survive. So how do we talk about resistance when we know so little about the people who were enslaved on our site? We do this through a variety of ways. One of the ways is through our analysis of objects. Over the course of 3 summers, from 1999 to 2001, archaeologists from Boston University partnered with our site to lead an archaeological dig, which helped us uncover a ton of objects and artifacts that have gone into the reinterpretation of the museum. Over 65,000 pieces of objects and artifacts, many fragmented, were uncovered. Over 5,000 of those objects were from the pre-revolutionary era. Some of these artifacts that were uncovered were different plates and punch glasses and wine bottles that often were stamped with the royal family seal. Outside of the different luxury items and artifacts that were recovered during the dig, we also uncovered a lot of artifacts that have helped us center the lives of the enslaved people. Number 1 is a milk pan. It is likely that a portion of the slave quarters building was used for dairying. After milking cows, enslaved women would have poured this milk into a wide, shallow pans. This would have allowed the maximum amount of cream to rise to the surface, which would have been separated. Archaeologists discovered pieces of 53 milk pans from the yards surrounding the slave quarters. Number 7 are gaming pieces. These gaming pieces were hand-shaped by enslaved people, and most likely even children, from discarded tiles and plates. Number 8 are marbles. These marbles were made from white and red local clay, and they were found in areas around the yard near the slave quarters that could not be observed from the mansion. These marbles remind us that enslaved children were here on this site. Number 11 is an amulet. We know that several people enslaved here had Akan names, which means that they likely came from what is now known as Ghana in West Africa. This object is a chip of stone made to look like an arrowhead. Any object of this shape found or made could be seen as powerful and used by enslaved people as a source of protection. So from this object, we can see that enslaved people not only created new cultures and tradition in Massachusetts, but they also maintained some of their original cultures and tradition from their countries of origin. All of these objects are essential to the way that we center the lives and experiences of the people who were enslaved by the royal family. These objects allow us to think about people outside of just the violation of slavery, how they played, how they interacted. One day, I hope you get a chance to come to the museum to see these powerful objects up close and personal. Although we know the names of 60-some women, children, and men who were enslaved by the Royals on Tin Hill Farm, we know the most about Belinda Sutton. In 1781, after Isaac Royall Jr. passes away, in his will, he leaves Belinda with the option to either remain enslaved and to go live in servitude with his daughter, or to choose her freedom. Obviously, Belinda Sutton chooses her freedom. But not only did she choose her freedom, she decided to exercise her rights to petition the Massachusetts Legislature Court for a pension. In 1783, she petitions for a pension for £15 and 12 shillings from the royal estate. The petition of Belinda, an African, humbly shows that 70 years have rolled away since she, on the banks of the Rio de Volta, received her existence. She was ravished from the bosom of her country, from the arms of her friends, while the advanced age of her parents, rendering them unfit for servitude, cruelly separated her from them forever. She learned to catch the ideas marked by the sounds of language, only to know that her doom was slavery, from which death alone was to emancipate her. And though she was a free moral agent accountable for her actions, she never had a moment at her own disposal. 50 years her faithful hands have been compelled to ignoble servitude for the benefit of an Isaac Royall. While she, by the laws of the land, is denied the enjoyment of one morsel of that immense wealth, a part whereof hath been accumulated by her own industry, and the whole augmented by her servitude. She prays that such allowance may be made her out of the estate of Colonel Royall, as will prevent her and her more infirm daughter from misery. Surprisingly, the Massachusetts legislature approves an annual pension for Belinda for £15. However, after the court gave Belinda the first payment, they missed the subsequent ones. And therefore, Belinda, over the course of 10 years, would go back to the court and petition for her pension 5 more times. Now, we don't really know what happens because we don't have a record of whether or not Belinda ever receives all of the money that was owed to her. However, this is an extraordinary case, and this is extraordinary for several reasons. One, it gives us a glimpse into how formerly enslaved people were utilizing the courts to challenge and define freedom on their own terms. Not only was it enough that they would no longer be enslaved, but people like Belinda were also making claims to having control over their own labor. In her actual petition, she talks about being compelled and forced into servitude for over 50 years from the royal family without ever receiving a dime. So after she secures her freedom, the first thing she does is she tries to recoup on some of that money that was owed to her. Another reason why Belinda's petitions are extremely vital is to also think about the community of enslaved and free Black people in Massachusetts. While we know that Belinda is illiterate because she signs her petition with an X, scholars also believe that Belinda had the help of famous Black abolitionist Prince Hall in writing her petition. Now, this is really, really important. It helps situate Belinda in a community of Black people, both free and enslaved, who are fighting for freedom and redefining what freedom means in Massachusetts writ large. In Massachusetts in general, there are a series of court cases that really actually propel Massachusetts to abolish slavery in 1783. Thank you so much for joining us on our virtual tour today. I really hope you learned something, and I hope you understand just how special this museum is, not only to me, but from all of us who work at the Royal House and Slave Quarters. I hope that you one day will have a chance to come in person so that you can see some of the objects and artifacts up close, so that you can walk through the halls and that you can understand the magnitude of slavery in the North and the impact that enslaved people had not only on the history of slavery on our side, but also on the history of freedom in Massachusetts.
All right, thank you, Kira, for such an excellent presentation. I think all of us learned a lot from this presentation about the history, the very rich history here and the Royal House. So we thank you for sharing all of this with us. And I would like to turn it over to Christy Egan, who is the Senior Director for Community Health and the Youth Program. Christy?
Dania, why don't you introduce yourself so that folks know who you are as well?
Of course, thank you. So my apologies for joining late, everyone. My name is Dania Day. I'm an interventional radiologist and the Diversity and Inclusion Officer for the Department of Radiology. And thank you all for joining us. Thanks, Christy.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask Kira to unmute herself and put herself on video.
So I actually can't, the host has to start my video. It's disabled.
I'm going to ask Carmen to, there we go. Hello, hello.
Hi.
Oh my goodness. Can I tell you that we have had a morning? We had a wonderful Juneteenth morning. We had a really full meal, and this to me was the dessert. So I thank you for bringing it, for showing up and showing out. I was not familiar, I've been here 20 years. I was not familiar with the Royal House and the slave quarters, and there's so much to talk about. So what I would love to do is to have our participants put your questions in the chat, and we will, or the Q&A, and we will siphon those out, but I'll get the ball rolling first. Two questions. The first is, do we know what the lineage then of the royal family has been? Where are they? What are they doing now? Just really interested in who now owns the estate. And you may have said that, but I've gotten so immersed in this house and the life that you all have brought to it. And the second question is, Belinda Sutton, wow, what a revolutionary, and how appropriate to call her name and invoke her spirit on the eve of Juneteenth. I'm wondering if she set a precedent, and if we had seen other slave men or enslaved folks ask for, she essentially was asking for her 40 acres and a mule.
Yeah.
And so did we see that in other places? Thank you.
Yeah, those are great.
Just tell participants, please put your questions in the Q&A or chat. Thank you.
Those are great questions. So I'll start with the first. So the museum has actually been a museum since technically 1899. It's a National Historic Landmark. So the royal family no longer controls the estate, but we have one of the royals who's been very, very active with our organization. Julia Royall was very active in helping us do the archaeological dig and also centering the lives of enslaved people. So that, she's a great friend to the museum. And, she's as invested in telling the truth about the history of slavery and her family's involvement as we are at the museum. So that's been, very wonderful. In terms of Belinda Sutton, I think in many ways, when we think about the long history of Black women have always utilized the courts in order to either enact change or at least to leave a record behind, knowing that they might not actually, win this court case or get whatever is owed to them and due to them. When I think about kind of the bravery and the courage of filing those petitions or filing freedom suits, or, in the 19th century, you have a lot of Black women going to the courts to talk about sexual violence. It is often to leave a record behind so that we know what happened to them. And so, when it comes to the 18th century, I hadn't really seen that happening. I saw it happening a lot in the 19th century. I hadn't really seen that happening in the 18th century until Belinda Sutton. So that was really eye-opening to me. But Belinda Sutton is a part of, a group of Black men and women who were utilizing the courts to often file freedom petitions. Belinda's petition is different because it's not a freedom petition. In many ways, it's asking for reparations in the 18th century. But there are a few other cases in which, but mostly enslaved men are also asking for kind of compensation as well. Those cases were not approved. And so Belinda,
isn't that
interesting because I don't want to make it to seem that, the Massachusetts State Court was so liberal at the time. They were not. They most likely approved that case because Isaac Royall Jr. was a loyalist, and it was a way, to punish the family and to take their possessions, right? But Belinda Sutton, over the course of 10 years, when she doesn't get the money that she is promised, continues to sue. And at one level, we have to say, she knew she wasn't gonna, ever get that money. So why was she doing it? And for me, it's the hope of getting it, but also to leave a record behind for us.
Absolutely. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. There's a question in the chat that asks, and I think you touched upon this, but if you have further information, whatever happened to Belinda Sutton?
That's a really great question. And we are in the process of doing more research. So I do not have a concrete answer for you, but we do know at some point Belinda Sutton moves to Boston. And that's, given the historical records, we are trying to find out more about Belinda Sutton. So for so long, we've had these petitions, and these petitions have allowed us to tell a certain story. But now I want to ask different questions, which is, how can we build out Belinda Sutton's life? And so we are in the course of doing that research. And I hope to be able to, in the next few months or a year, to actually have some good information to present about what happened to her. We do know that she dies around in the 1790s, because a petition is filed, which basically says she is no longer living, and the royal family is actually requesting the money that was put aside for her back.
They never gave it to her, and now they're asking for it back. That's
Yeah.
so fascinating.
Yeah.
A personal question for you, Kira, in the chat. What brought you to this work? And I'm sorry for the noise outside. I live in the community, so one's liable to hear anything. What brought you to this work and to this museum? And how did this become your passion? Why is this story important for you to share? And wonderful presentation is added.
Thank you. I originally, came to the museum actually by accident. I was here in the summer of 2019 attending a conference for women historians known as the Little Burks at Radcliffe Institute. And there was a professor who teaches at Tufts University named Dr. Kendra Field, who basically was like, if you all haven't been to the Royal House and Slave Quarters, you should go check it out. And I'm from New Jersey, and I studied slavery, and I had slave quarters outside of the South. What? So I, Googled it, I looked at it, and then I said, okay. And so several of my friends and myself, we went over there, and I was really blown away. And at the time, I had no idea I would end up working at the museum, but I left feeling deeply impacted. And then the opportunity, I was here on a dissertation fellowship in the history department at Harvard, and the job posting came up, and wow. One of my advisors was like, I think you have to apply. It's perfect for you. So I did it, but I've always been passionate about Black history. I've always been passionate about the history of slavery. I think we know so little still about slavery, and there's so much more to learn. There's been amazing work done, but there's so much more to learn. And in many ways, we've been told as Black people, as historians, as people of color in general, when trying to do work on our history, that, there's not much, the documents aren't there. You're not going to find as much as you want. And while that's true, sometimes, I think sometimes you have to ask different questions of that archive. And sometimes you have to do the hard work. And I'm really excited, to do that work, because it's not good enough to say we can never know enough. We can never know that information. I think we can know that information, or we have to be creative and read against the grain to try to fill it out about this history. So
agreed. I mean, there are so many hidden figures, and wouldn't it be, if we could dream the impossible, and I'm always saying, why not?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be wonderful if every child in Massachusetts knew about Belinda Sutton? Right?
That's what I'm working on.
Why can that be possible? Right?
Yeah, that's what I'm working on. That is the goal.
Yes. Well, any way that we can help you in that goal, please let us know. There's another question in the chat. I've heard. I'm gonna try to be succinct in it. They understand that the royal family had given their wealth, which they made by enslaving and exploiting people, to Harvard, either for the medical school or the law school, and it ended up going to the law school. Has there been any research that has uncovered more than that story?
Yeah, that's a very great question. So when Isaac Royall Jr. passes away, he leaves land that is then sold by the university, and that has funded the Royal professorship at the Harvard Law School. And there have been an amazing movement around that led by Harvard Law students a few years ago. But also there's a wonderful new initiative called Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery that launched, and they are doing a lot of research to talk about Harvard's connections to slavery. And so when it comes to our site, we have partnered with them to do programming this year. And we've had a program on we want to talk about the historical legacy of slavery, slavery, but also the legacies that slavery has left today. And so our first program was on housing inequality throughout Boston. And we had some wonderful panelists talk to us about the history of redlining and gentrification. And then our next joint program that we're doing is actually going to be with Clint Hill Smith, who just had his new book.
Yes.
Yeah, about the legacy of kind of slavery and in the public. And so we're really excited about this partnership because it is a way for us to explore kind of the complicated history between the institution and our site, but also to think about how the legacy of slavery impacts, Black communities and communities of color today.
Yes, it has a long-lasting legacy, doesn't it? I mean, we look at the school to prison pipeline, and that there is something to be said about the origins of that. I've got a question for you, and again, please continue to send your questions through the Q&A. If the Royals came over in 1737 and slavery ended in Boston in 1783, what happened to their enslaved people? Did they all have the option of being released? I hate saying that about another human being, but what happened to them? It's a short window given the span of what we know slavery looked like, right?
Yeah. So it's a really great question. So before the royal family migrates to Medford, they're running a huge plantation in Antigua. We know that based on that operation, Isaac Royall Sr., is a slave trader and sells about 274 enslaved people. He actually only brings over 27 enslaved people with the family. But then over the course of time, because of the slave trade, that number grows and then it gets smaller. But once Isaac Royall Jr. flees, we know that some enslaved people are left behind. And we also know, based on the will, the only person that he gives the option of freedom to is Belinda Sutton. So it opens up a whole lot of questions, actually. And we imagine, enslaved people who were still there. We know from his letters that while he was in Nova Scotia or England, he's writing back to community members in Medford to ask them to sell some of the enslaved people who are left because he needs money while he's in exile. So we know that he's still engaging in the trade, but at a certain point, we don't really know kind of what happens to everyone. We imagine, the people who were left ended up, going into the community, they take their freedom. But it's a really good question. And it is a question that with more research, I am also hoping to have a better answer to, because the thing is that we know that over the course of 40 years, they enslaved at least 60 people. It was probably much more, but those are the 60 names we know. But being able to trace them becomes a little difficult when you don't always have a first and a last name. And so trying to find more information about the people who we know the most about, but also really trying to think creatively about where the royal family might appear in other people's records in Medford, because other people are engaging in the slave trade as well. So it's kind of a puzzle. It's a really exciting and interesting puzzle. But enslaved people were always taking, they always knew they were free, right? They were always, they hated slavery. They were always taking their own freedom into their own hands. So, they're running away. They're doing all different types of things. So being able to track people has been a little difficult, but with a concerted research effort, we should be able to learn more about kind of where people went.
And I thank you for that. When I heard about the slave who ran away to Lynn, I thought, well, he needed to go up. He should have been going to Canada Lynn was probably not where he wanted to go. We've got a few more questions. I'm going to take a question from Carmen, who asked, how surprised are you, or how surprised are people when they find out that there were slaves in the North, particularly in Massachusetts? What do people's general reactions look like? What's the gamut that their emotions go through?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are shocked to know about the extent of slavery in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, thinks very highly of itself, especially through the lens of the legacy of abolitionism here, right?
Right.
So
Right.
everyone wants to talk about abolitionists, and everybody wants to talk about how Massachusetts was one of the first colonies to actually abolish slavery, but no one wants to talk about how it was the first colony to legalize it. No one also wants to talk about the fact that abolitionists don't exist if there's nothing to abolish.
Exactly.
So what are they? Yeah. So slavery is all around here, and it's integral to the actual economy of Massachusetts. You cannot talk about Massachusetts without talking about the history of slavery. But when people find out that there were so many enslaved people, I think people go, wow, how come I never knew this history? Why wasn't this taught to me? And I think that goes to a larger question about kind of what the curriculum looks like throughout Massachusetts, as well as the sorry, my dog is pretty active, but the hesitancy to talk about slavery because it brings up bad feelings,
and it's easier to say it was down there, down south. It was those people versus us.
Exactly.
Right.
But everyone's implicated in it.
Yes.
The North,
Yes.
the South, you can't, it is a global enterprise. It is a global enterprise. And Massachusetts benefited handsomely from it. So I think one of the, people are angry, people are upset. There are people who are ashamed because learning this history is painful. But my main goal is that once people learn about this history, that they don't just say, wow, the 18th century was terrible. But they say the 18th century was terrible. I'm happy to know that, more about this. But they leave the museum and they go, how does this impact communities of color today? How do we talk about the long history of racism? And that's what I want people to do. I want people to feel as though they don't just leave this past in the past, but they ask how the past, affects us in the present.
Yes.
And that's really important to me. And it's also really important to me that we don't just say everyone needs to learn about the history of slavery. Obviously, I want everyone to learn about the history of slavery. But I'm also sensitive enough to know that sometimes people don't want to talk about that history. So how do you get them to the museum? How do you get them to engage with us? If I go to talk to communities in East Boston, I might ask them what do they want to talk about? They might want to talk about environmental racism in the new substation. So how can we talk about environmental racism? That has a long connection to, structural racism and slavery. Some people might want to talk about mass incarceration. So let's talk about mass incarceration in the long history of slavery. You can meet people where they are and talk about the things that are impacting them on a daily basis, as well as connect it to the history. So as a museum and thinking very seriously about what our role is to communities, it's not only to talk about the past, but to help communities, reckon with the present, to help them, process what's going on in their daily lives. And I think that is extremely important for us to do.
And I think that's there's such a powerful point that slavery has some pinning to everything that we do today. Right. So let's not forget that it's all interconnected. So I appreciate that. One last question, and then we'll do our thank yous. And it seems as though your dog would like to be on camera. It's okay.
I think so.
We can see her.
Let me grab her. Come here, Zora.
It's 4 o'clock on a Friday. It's all good. So I hope that folks will endeavor and endure with us. Hello. The last question is, if we want to visit the museum, will you be there so we can meet you? A group of us plan to visit it and would like to meet you. I'm sure others are inspired and would like to meet you as well and see the museum. So,
yeah, so we will be opening next month, actually, and you know, I don't typically do the day-to-day tours. I usually do like special tours, so we can make that happen if you all reach out to me. And I'll be around all summer at the museum, so I'll probably stop in and say hi to different people. But yeah, please come check out the museum. You can visit our website to learn more, theroyalhouse.org, and you can become a member, support us, find out about our programming. I'm really, really excited about what this next year will look like. So
is she.
Yes.
And with that, I'm going to thank you so much. Thank you, Ashe. This has been a wonderful conversation. Before folks go, I think Carmen would just like to say a few words. But Kira, thank you, and thank you for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you. What a wonderful conversation. And the Q&A was fantastic. Thank you so much, Kiara. I'm very, very impressed by everything that I saw, and very touched and very moved, which is why I asked that question. I'm sure that when we visit, it's even more impactful. So I'm really looking forward to partnering with you in the future to see how we can bring our youth to see the museum, and so that we can help you with your mission to bring this to our youth. I think that that's very important. And speaking of our mission, I'd like to take a few moments to thank Anand Narayan, who is our former diversity officer in the Department of Radiology, who is taking a lead role in the University of Wisconsin now, as head of equity there. However, right before he left, he really had it as the vision to liaise with the museum, and he has funded this tour and this partnership here for us today using his very own Frigoletto grant for the development of URM faculty and staff. So I'd like to say thank you to Anand for that specifically. And also our incoming diversity officer, Dania Day, I'd like to thank her for joining us. And Dania, do you have any other lasting words for us?
Of course, thank you, Carmen. I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. I think we all learned so much between all the different presentations that we saw, and especially Kira, thank you for teaching us so much in this presentation. I know many of us will be visiting the museum over the coming months, so thank you for that. And again, thank you all for joining us. I want to especially thank Carmen for all the work that she's done putting this program together. Thank you, Carmen. And we hope you'll join us for future programmings that we'll be doing around diversity and inclusion. Thanks, everyone.
I'd like to thank Christy, who is an incredible partner to us in radiology and the MGH youth programs. Please look them up. I'd like to always shout them out because Christy is not only a partner to us, but is a collaborator and a strategic everything. So I just want to thank you so much, Christy, for everything that you do with us, but also that you do for the MGH youth programs and our kids. So thank you, Christy.
Thank you, Christy. All right, and thanks everyone for joining. This ends our program.